In this exercise, we're going to work on the bodice with gathers. In the industry, gathers will also be called shirring, but I just thought I'd keep it simple and we'll call them gathers for now. Now, this is going to be considered the bodice, and we're going to cut one of these, and then this is going to be the gathered, what we'll call a ruffle, and we're also going to cut one of these, but we're actually going to cut these on the fold of the fabric. So when it says cut on fold here as well, we're going to actually fold the fabric over and cut out of the fabric. We don't normally do this, but to save space in the paper, or having you to actually cut two of these and then tape it together in the center, it's just a little bit easier to have you cut it on the fold. So if you look, I have a notch here, and that's called a control notch, and we're going to be matching that notch here, and then we're going to be gathering these ends in to meet the side seam and toward the center. So I have two little notches, slim notches here at the center, where we're going to actually notch those out too, because we're going to clip that. Because remember, we're cutting these on the fold, so this is going to be twice as big. So how do I know it's a 2-to-1? Well, the center of this matches to that center notch there, and then that center matches to there, which means that this ruffle is twice as long as the waist of this bodice we're putting this in. So the first thing I need to do is I'm going to actually punch all of these notches, and I'll just do that really quick. Now, when you clip this notch here, we want to do a half notch. So sometimes if you turn your notcher over, you can see a little window, and you'll be able to set it so it's the middle of where that notch is going to cut, right? And then these ones here, turn this over, and I don't know if you can see that, and I don't know if I'm going to get half of it in there. All right, and then I have one down here. Now, what is this notch for? Okay, so there's one notch down here. What's that notch for? Well, that's actually for a hem. And if you remember level 1, we did a whole series of rolled hems. The distance from the notch to the bottom of the ruffle is a 1/2 inch, so this will be a finished, do you remember what that measurement will be? It will be a finished 1/4 inch rolled hem. So let's just have a look at the finished product really quick that we are actually going to be doing. So this is the face side, and this is the rolled hem that I just talked about. It's a 1/4 inch rolled hem, and we're actually going to be performing that first. So I want to get these all cut out. So I'm going to cut these out really quick, and then we'll be ready to sew. Okay, so now that I've got everything cut out, I didn't mention it before, but you saw me just after I traced the patterns, I actually put pins around. That's just so that the fabric doesn't move around while I'm cutting. And then I came back, and actually I forgot to mark my notch here, so I had to use the pattern, reestablish that notch, and then I clipped it. And then I just came in here in the center and then just clip the center. Now when you're clipping your notches, make sure that you only clip in about 1/4 inch. And then of course I've got my matching notch there, and then the center notch here. I don't have a center notch down here where the hem is because that's going to be rolled in. That doesn't match anything. It's this center notch here that's going to match with the center notch here. So I'm actually going to open these up, and so I'm going to take these pins out, and I'm going to establish the face side of the fabric. All right, so I'll take my pen, gonna mark the face side. Now, what are we doing first? Do you remember what I said? We're gonna do the hem first. So I'm gonna go over and I'm gonna press this up 1/2 inch. I'm not gonna show that on camera, but I'm just going to press that up 1/2 inch. You could even do that with your finger if you would like. If you don't want to pull the iron out, just make sure that you've got 1/2 inch, a good 1/2 inch pressed up. Again, I'm not going to show me pressing this up 1/2 inch. I'm going to trust that you can do that. If you need to, have your ruler ready at the pressing board, and so that you get a good 1/2 inch all the way down. And then we'll do that rolled hem first. Okay, so I've got my shirring piece here, and I've pressed up that hem allowance, and understand at this notch is where the finished length is. So we pressed it up 1/2 inch, and we need to make this a finished 1/4 inch rolled hem. So 1/2 of 1/2 inch is 1/4 inch. So what we actually need to do is we need to slightly open this up, and this cut edge here, we're gonna fold into our pressed edge, and then we're gonna fold it over again. Right? And it should equal here where our notch is. And I'm going to put a pin there just so you can see it. I'm going to pin a little bit so you can see what we're actually going for. And if you layer, this is a little bit easier because it's cotton, and then you can just fold it in and then fold it over again. And then I'm going to put a pin here. Now you can do this all the way down if you're just starting out, but this is actually what the finished look is going to be. And this is where I have these pins, is right about where we're going to stitch. So right here, right next to that folded edge. And I'm going to fold this as I continue to go. I'm not going to use pins all the way because we should be practicing sewing really without a lot of pins. So I'm going to get this started though. I need to take this first pin out. So I'm going to put this underneath the press foot, and I'm going to get that needle right here, right on that edge of that folded edge. Put the needle down, and I'm stitching using regular stitch length, 12 to 14 stitches per inch, right there at that edge, and I'm just going to backstitch to tack it into place. Okay, and now here coming up to this other pin, the idea is that you're rolling this to that folded edge and then rolling it over again. And then you're stitching right here on the edge because you really want that to measure as close to 1/4 inch from this edge, right? We're gonna measure, let's see, I don't have enough, I'll wait till I get some more sewn. So what I do sometimes is I use my finger and I just kind of pick up that cut edge and I just kind of tuck it in to that folded edge, and then I can give it a little finger press, and then it folds right in, and then I stitch that down watching this edge, right? And then when I'm getting close again, I'm just kind of pushing this, my finger will kind of roll that in, just making sure that I'm getting an even roll, that this rolled edge here is nice and even. Picking up a little bit more. And sewing. This is a great thing to practice, especially if you're going to be doing custom work. You'll be doing a lot of these 1/4 inch rolled seams on a lot of your custom work. So it'll be either the hem edge of a dress or the hem edge of a nice circular full sleeve. I've got the rest of that done now. I'm just following this up. I'm coming up to the edge. Now see that I've got that right there on that notch. That's my finished rolled edge. And I'm coming up, I'm getting ready to backstitch at the end. And I can take this out and clip those threads. Now, of course, this roll is, of course, on the inside. So what we want is the outside to look really even. And then, of course, what I meant by the 1/4 inch, when we measure things, we're going to be measuring from that stitch edge to the edge of the garment. And that is what we mean by a 1/4 inch finished rolled hem. So now we actually need to prepare this for the shirring. So I'm going to go over and press this really quick. I'm going to do that off camera. You don't need to see me just press this flat side. I think we can handle that. And then I'm going to come right back here and I'm going to prepare this panel piece for the shirring. Okay, so I've got my shirring piece all nicely pressed, and now I'm going to prepare it for the shirring. And what that is I'm going to be sewing rows of basting stitches, which are very long stitches, and I'm going to sew them right here. This is the seam allowance here that is actually going to be sewn into the top of the bodice. So we're going to create the shirring here on this piece. It's going to be all gathered up in nice even shirring gathers. So the way I like to do it is that I like to do 3 rows, and the reason I like to do 3 rows is because it's easier to control and it's easier to get a really nice even gathering shirring look. So I know I use gathering and shirring interchangeably. Gathers are usually a little looser and shirring is a little bit tighter. So this piece is actually somewhere in between there. So what I like to do, why I like to do 3 rows, and we're going to do 1 row of stitching right on that seam allowance line, and I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then we're going to do 1 stitch line between the seam allowance and the edge of the fabric. So that's at a 1/4 inch. And then we're going to do 1 more stitch line outside of the seam allowance onto the garment. Now, if you're working with a very fine fabric, you may not be able to do the 3rd row. The reason I like to do the 3rd row is that row helps keep the gathers or shirring in place as you're sewing on the garment. So and once we get to there, you'll kind of understand that a little bit better. But that 3rd row, which is outside of that seam allowance line, holds on to the gathers and it keeps it from actually looking like pleats. So I'm going to first do the stitch line on the seam allowance so you can see what I mean. So we're not back stitching. I'm going to turn my stitch dial, you can hear it clicking, all the way to the longest stitch length on my machine. My machine is at a 5. Yours may be at a 4. So now that I'm going to stitch at a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to start here at the edge, and I'm not back stitching because we're going to need to pull these threads after we sew. So now these are very long stitches, so the machine is going to take the fabric very fast, no matter how fast you're sewing. So just watch how fast this goes, okay? So it's taking the fabric really fast, so you'll just have to work a little slow or just test it out before you actually sew the actual garment. So this is at a 1/2 inch. I'm going to stop here right at the end. Now I'm going to lift the needle all the way up, and then I'm going to release it, and I'm going to pull this. Hold on here onto the stitches as you pull it out. Otherwise, you may break your thread or pull a stitch out, right? And you want to keep a length of thread, a very good length of thread, about 6 inches at least, on, right? You don't want to clip your threads here because we're going to need to pull these threads to actually get the gathering and shirring in there. Okay, and you want to keep both ends with long threads. So now that I've got, this is my stitch line at the 1/2 inch. Now I'm going to do a stitch line right in between in the middle. And it'll be hard for you to see it, but I'm going to actually stitch in the same direction that I did before. And I'm going to use this stitch line on the edge of my presser foot here. So that's going to be my guide. And I'm going to sew exactly the same way I did before. So needle down, very long stitch length, right? And make it as even as possible. And just go along and do this stitching. Now, let's keep this long. Again, so now I have 2 rows with long tails on both ends. Right, now I'm going to do my third. Now remember, this is my 1/2 inch, so I want to do it into the garment. So I'm going to do it on the other side of that 1/2 inch stitch line. So right there at the beginning. And then go ahead and sew using the edge of your presser foot as your guide. So when I finish this here, I will have 3 rows of basting stitch or very long stitches, 1/4 inch apart from each other. And one more stitch and I'll take it out. And keep this one long as well. Okay, so now I've got 3 strands of very long threads on both sides, right? Okay, so now why did I know I kind of explained before why I have 3, and some people will say, why did you do this right on the stitch line? Well, understand that these are really long stitches. So even if we see this on the outside of the garment, we can pull it out once it's actually sewn into the seam. Because when we sew this into the seam, we're going to use our regular stitch length, 12 to 14 inches. And then, of course, we'll rip this stitch out as well. So the reason is because I want my shearing or gathering to be as accurate as possible. And if I stitch this basting stitch, which I'm going to use to gather, away from my actual seam line, my gathering may not be accurate and it may not keep gathers in the right place. So that's why I stitched this right on the seam line. And then this other line inside the seam allowance is to help me gather. And then this outside is actually help to keep the gathers shearing help to keep them even, and also to keep it gathered while I'm sewing on this seam. And again, once we get done with this, you'll understand exactly why. So now that we've done that, let's go over to the pressing table, and we're not going to press it, but we're actually going to work on creating our gathered shearing. Okay, so we're ready to work on our shearing. I just brought the bodice in here to remind you that we're going to be sewing this gathered piece to here. We haven't gathered it yet, but we've already sewn our gathering stitches, our shearing stitches. So I'm just going to set this bodice piece aside for right now. So now, before I start pulling these to actually shear it / gather it, I want to take note of the 3 notches that I have here on it. I have one on either side and then one in the center. And I know I just set this aside, but we're going to match all of these notches after we gather. So those are my control notches. We call those control notches. So I'll set that aside. So what I'm going to do is I'll take my erasable pen or some chalk, and I could just kind of like to mark those, because once this is all gathered, sheared together, it's going to be hard to see those notches. So this is where I need to match those. So I'm just going to give myself a visual to help do that, to help find the notches afterward. So this is the face side. I have it marked here. And what I like to do, I'm going to flip this over, and I like to pull the bobbin thread. This is the bobbin thread. And I'm going to take a little pin here, and I'm just going to kind of separate those threads here. There's one. There is another. Kind of pulled those away, and then here's another. Okay, so these are really the threads you want to be pulling. Okay, so I'm going to hold on to smooth this over, and I'm just going to hold on to these 3, and I'm just going to hold my fingers lightly, the fabrics between my fingers, and then I'm just going to pull on the, I'm just going to gently pull the fabric away from those. Now, don't keep pulling on these, at great length. If you get a really long thread, you may break the thread, and then you'll have to go back and redo your basting stitches. But see how that's gathering up here right now. It's all gathered here, or sheared. What I like to do is I like to kind of twist this around the threads around my finger to get a shorter distance to what I'm actually doing, right? And then I'm going to pull. I'm not really pulling on with this hand. I'm just moving the fabric away, right? And then I'll twist some more on my finger. And I like to put a lot more gathering and shearing on the piece than is really necessary. So that seems like a lot. So I'm going to release this on this hand, and then I'm going to do the same thing coming from the other side. I don't like to do it all the way across because that's a lot of work. So I'm going to use my pin again. I'm going to grab just these bobbin threads, and I'm going to kind of wrap them around my finger, and then I'm going to take lightly between my two fingers and then just move the fabric away, and then I'll twist up, and then see here with the gathering, I'm just moving those further along. And I just continue doing that, right? And you can see that the bottom is starting to get nice and twisty, getting a good flounce going on. I'm going to move these a little bit closer to the center. Okay, then I'll release this. Now, of course, that's a lot of gathering. Of course, this is the wrong side, but I want to bring in my shearing piece here again, right? These are the notches we actually need to match this to, right? But this is very, very short, right? So I'm going to turn this over to the face side now, so we can see it looks a little bit prettier. So now with this all sheared up, again, it's hard to find out where those notches are. That's why I made little marks for those three notches. So this here, this mark here is the center, right? And then this other mark is here to match for this notch, right? I way over gathered and sheared this area. And the same for here. This is the mark here to match to this notch. Let me also mark the notches on the bodice so you can see. So this is where we want to match to, right? So we can see, so we actually need to release some of these gathers. So I'm just going to lightly pull away on either side, right? And if we release too much, of course, we can just go in and gather again. So what I like to do, let's match up. It's almost a good size. So, but we can't put it on like this because these gathers, these shearing are not even. So you're going to have to manipulate by moving the gathers out toward the edge and make sure that you don't take too much off of the edge, right? So what we're going to be doing is looking for really even shearing and just kind of gently tug. And I've got here's my center mark right there, and there's my center, but then here is my next notch. I'm still a ways away from that, so I'm just going to use my finger and see if I can move some of those gathers away. And that looks like it's matching up there. How am I here? It looks like I'm matching up here pretty good, but you also want to make sure that you're matching your edges. So one of the challenges is that when you're trying to make your gathers even toward the edges, that you have this extra area that might be kind of flat. So you really want to work this to get these as even as possible to the center, and you can just kind of pick at them with your fingernail, the end of your finger, just to get them to separate a little bit so you can get more even. This one's not being very helpful. Get them a little bit even. If you go a little bit over, you can grab your threads and of course just pull gently to get that to fit back in. Are we looking even? Here in the middle, it's looking pretty even. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and match those. So this one from here to here, it looks fairly even. So I'm going to bring my bodice down here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to now match my markings, my notches, and I'm going to pin them in place. So I've got this marking, so I'm going to fold this over, and we can see that I've got that mark. This is the center. Okay, so that's where that needs to go. And the way that I pin these is perpendicular to the edge of the fabric. Okay, and then I'm going to find that next mark, right? So that's the notch. I'll match that notch, and I'm pinning in perpendicular. And then I've got find the other notch, which is right up here, and these were even, so match that notch there. And again, I'm going to pin perpendicular in at that notch. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to kind of finish these edges up. So what I'm going to do, now if this were a circular piece, of course you would match your seam allowances, and then it would be a little bit easier to make sure that everything is pretty even. And I'm just going to make sure that I can pull this in and match this edge up. And then between these two pins, I can just kind of pick at this, make it look a little bit more even here. Now what do I have to do? I probably just need a little bit more on this edge. I need to separate those threads they got all together. So I didn't speed this section up because I wanted you to see how much care, how much time it actually takes to get these right. And this is just a very small Shirring gathers, and I can't see that thread. There we go. You can't separate your threads and you can't really pull to get those gathers. So just pull that to match that edge. Now that I've got that edge matched, I can put this in perpendicularly, and then I'm just going to kind of scratch at these to get those a little bit more even. Now, one of the things, I'm going to turn this the other way because remember the center seam, this center line here is actually my seam allowance, right? And so I will be stitching on that, but I'm not going to be stitching on this side. I'm going to actually be stitching on this side. And there's a reason for that. But before I get to that reason, I want to remind you that this line here is actually to keep all of the gathers in place. If I only had this stitch line, then as I sew, I might be pushing the gathers out of the way and they will be ill-formed. So the challenge is you want these to be perpendicular to your stitching, to the edge of your fabric. So I'm probably just going to realign this up a little bit better. And I might put some additional pins here into these sections so everything is even and everything remains perpendicular. I'm going to bring my pins in here, see if I can get this done a little bit quicker. So you can see I'm pinning perpendicular in between each of those pins where I had it, because I want these gathers or shirring, depending on how tightly you are wanting your appearance, you want to make sure that those are actually going perpendicular from where you're stitching. Okay, I think I'm going to put one more here. Okay. But now I'm not going to, if I stitched on this side where I had all of my gathering, then the presser foot is going to actually push these forward. And what I want is I need the help of the feed dogs. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stitch from this side. I'll stitch a 1/2 inch seam on this side, and what the feed dogs will do is they will actually pull on those gathers to help keep them in alignment from being and keep them from being pushed away. So what we will also have to do is watch underneath to make sure that everything is still staying perpendicular to that seam. And this will actually still be seen on the outside, but once we're done with the garment, we can pull that seam right out. So this is all ready to sew. So we've got these pins, and we'll pull the pins out right before we get to them. So we're ready to go over to the machine and sew these two pieces together. Okay, so we're ready to actually sew the shirring onto the bodice body. So I have it pinned here. I have a lot of pins, and I'm going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance from here. And we're going to backstitch to start, and we're using our regular stitch length, 12 to 14 stitches per inch. But one of the things that you're going to have to keep an eye on, you'll have to keep looking underneath here to make sure that this shirring is actually keeping perpendicular with that seam. So let's kind of get this started here. I'm going to put this under 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'll pull this first pin out, foot down, needle down. I'm going to backstitch. Okay, and then look under here to make sure that everything still looks pretty straight. And I'm going to go ahead and sew, and I'll pull these pins out as I go, right? And then we want to look under here to make sure everything is still nice and straight, right? So that's what we're going to be doing. Taking each pin out, go some more, and then check here on this side that the next section is going to be very perpendicular, right? You don't want your shirring to be pulled in a different direction. Okay, well we're about in the middle. All these are going still perpendicular. Okay, check again, perpendicular. Next pin, we're okay. Next pin, keep checking underneath here. We see that here. We're almost there, we're almost done. Checking here, pulling it this way so it's perpendicular. Grab my last pin, and I'm going to get ready to backstitch. And backstitch. Okay, let's clip our threads. We can clip all of them because it's been sewn, right? Can even clip all of these. Whoops, that got into the seam, but that's okay. Clip that, those will come right out. Clip all of these up here. Now let's just have a quick look here at the machine, how these look. I don't see any obvious pulling in any way, so that's good. So we'll check the rest of this out at the pressing mat. Okay, so now we're ready to finish up the shirring gathering exercise. And the only thing that we really need to do is we just need to pull out this extra stitching here that we did to keep everything together. And then also we need to look at the seam and see if we see any of our other stitching that need to come out, like here and over here. So all we really need to do, these are, remember, really long stitches, so we can just kind of pull with a seam ripper. Make sure you get a long piece of it, and you can actually just pull at it and it will break, and just kind of pull at it again, and then come to the underside and you will have another thread and you can pull it again. And that's not working so well for me. Just pull a little bit more out at a time. Get here underneath. Sometimes it's easier, the bobbin side is a little bit better, and then you can pull. There it is, the whole thing just kind of came out. Okay, so that was the outside one. Now we have some parts here where we see the thread from one of our other lines of stitching, and I'm just going to come in here and grab some of these stitches, right? And here at the end on the other side, grab this stitch and then pull those other ones out. So we just need to get all of these pulled out. Kind of feel your way here. Remember, this is all sewn together, so you're not going to lose any of your gathering. Okay, so I have all of the threads pulled out. We can't see any of those threads visible. Now, we really don't want to press this because it will lose its fluffiness, its prettiness, especially if, of course, this is muslin, but of course, if you have a really nice, supple fabric, you don't want to lose any of the bounce. So if you feel like there are some parts that do need to be pressed, this is the best way to do it. So I'm going to turn this over to the inside, because the reason I do that is because the shirring is on the outside, so this is where the fluffiness is. So I'm going to turn it to the inside, and the way I would press it is that I would take the iron and I would come in from the bottom and go perpendicularly in between some of those ripples, like making sure that I'm not creating any new creases. So just press in perpendicularly to those gathers or that shirring, and just be very careful about it so that you don't create any creases as you're going along, right? Just like that. That's how I would press if you really, really needed to. So the shirring exercise is done. So we just need to label it shirring gathering, your name and the date, and this is all ready to go into your notebook.